Good day. We remain in the Ukrainian conflict zone in what might be described as the calm before the storm which will probably start to develop once the four regions which have now held referendums and which were either formally or de jure still parts of Ukraine are incorporated into Russia. Now, on that, there's been again some indications that the Russians have shifted their timetable. Latest reports are that President Putin and his top military advisors are to have what is called an operational meeting of the Security Council this evening. That's on the 29th of September. And it's now suggested that the votes by the Federation Council, presumably the Duma, and President Putin's own signature to complete the process, all of these votes to incorporate the four regions into Russia will take place tomorrow, September 30th, wrapping up this entire process this week. And there are further reports that are now being referenced both in Russian and Ukrainian channels, and which have been picked up in such places as Britain's Daily Telegraph, that large Russian forces are now assembling in Belgorod and Rostov regions of Russia, preparing to move into the four regions of Ukraine, and perhaps also launch a counteroffensive in the case of the grouping in Belgorod in the Kharkiv direction. So, as I said, we could be seeing fairly soon lots of things start to happen. In the meantime, fighting has continued in and around the North Donetsk town of Liman. Yesterday witnessed another attempt by Ukrainian forces to try to capture Liman. It was thrown back, apparently with heavy losses. Russian reports claimed that in this area of the front lines, Ukraine is now losing around 200 men killed a day. Obviously a figure I am in no position to corroborate. There are also claims by Russian channels that there are as many as 30,000 Ukrainian troops concentrated in this area, a figure which, by the way, I strongly doubt. But anyway, there we are. Still fighting going on around Liman. Almost certainly more fighting going on around Liman today. Strong prospect of major Russian reinforcements rolling west into the Donbass regions and initiating a counteroffensive, perhaps in Kharkiv region as well. So, as I said, we do look to be in the quiet before the storm. I'm going to say just a few quick things about that. I am seeing more and more reports, which originate, by the way, from Ukrainian channels, that Zelensky himself is becoming deeply frustrated by the Ukrainian military's failure to achieve any decisive breakthrough as a result of the various offensives that Ukraine launched over the course of this month, over the course of September. And there's been some rather interesting developments about this, some rather interesting bits and bobs of information, which I can't, by the way, confirm as true, but which might be true and which I think are worth both brief mention and discussion. Firstly, as a number of people have been pointing out, August represented 6 months from the start of Russia's special military operation. Now, it seems that when the Russians launched their special military operation, many of the professional troops who were sent into battle were about to come to the end of their contracted terms, but were required to stay on and given 6-month extensions to their terms. Those 6-month extensions ended in August. none of them, or very few of them apparently, decided to sign up for a further 6-month term, which, by the way, doesn't surprise me. That is exactly what you would expect of combat soldiers. After 6 months, most of them would definitely want to go back to civilian life, to meet up with their families, to move on. Anyway, that was the decision most of them made. And the result was that Russian forces apparently lost a significant number of men in August, men who might have been there on the battlefields. And I've seen some suggestions that the totality of Russian forces in Ukraine by the end of August had fallen from about 80,000 in July to something like 50,000. In other words, a pretty sharp decline, principally caused by rotation of forces, the fact that soldiers like the Chechen fighters and those people were given furlough to recover after the fighting, the intense fighting of the previous months, leading up to the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, but also in part because many of these soldiers with extended 6-month contracts chose not to extend them. Now, because I don't know whether this is true, but it's been reported now in many places, and it does look actually plausible, and it is very consistent with human psychology, I should say. Now, if that is really the case, if 50,000 men, if the Russian forces at the end of August, the start of September, were down to 50,000 men, then a lot of what happened in September suddenly becomes explicable. It would explain, for example, why there were so few Russian troops to defend Kharkiv region, and why the Russians are still finding it difficult to put together enough forces to counter Ukrainian attacks, and not just in Kharkiv region, but in northern Donetsk region, where there's been these Ukrainian attacks on Liman. So that makes a kind of sense. I would add, by the way, that if Russian forces had indeed been reduced to 50,000, then it's highly likely that out of that 50,000, the bulk of them, perhaps around 30,000, had been repositioned to Kherson region in order to counter the Ukrainian offensive, which had been much talked about and was expected there. And I would also expect a significant force, perhaps 10,000 or so, probably talking mainly about infantry here, to be in Zaporozhye region and in southern Donetsk to shield places like the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and Mariupol from attacks from Zaporozhye and Ugleda, the Ukrainian town, the southern Donbass town of Ugleda. So perhaps it's not surprising in that case why there were so few forces in the north to hold the Izium-Balaklia area, and also perhaps even at this time in northern Donbass. Now, I have to say that this is not particularly complimentary to the Russians that they got themselves into this position. One could argue that they should have realized months before this was about to happen that they would need to redeploy more troops from Russia itself to northern Donbass and to Kharkiv region to counter any possible Ukrainian attacks there, especially given that this decline in Russian troop numbers coincided with the waxing of Ukrainian troop numbers after the 4 or is it 7 mobilizations that Ukraine has conducted. To be very clear, the Ukrainian armed forces, according to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, now number around 400,000. So you can see that if we're talking about pure, just, regular army, the Russians in Ukraine are now outnumbered 8-1. Of course, you mustn't just look at regular army. There would have been, of course, the troops from the militias, the Donetsk and Lugansk militias, also the Wagner group, all of those forces, and that would add quite a large number of troops. Some of them not, however, though, of full professional quality. But anyway, we could perhaps be talking about a force in eastern Ukraine, a combined allied force of around 100 to 120,000 men. Still very heavily outnumbered by the Ukrainian military. And you'd have thought that the Russians would have taken note of that fact and would have done something to prepare for it. Well, they didn't, and there may be all kinds of explanations for that, perhaps political explanations, perhaps there was disagreements within the government about this. There's been some suggestions that sections of the Russian military were uneasy about deploying more troops in Ukraine itself, arguing that this was a departure from Russian doctrine, which is that the Russian armed forces are primarily earmarked for the defense of Russia itself. And there might have been some discussion and debate with the military about this. I'm going to come to why that might be important shortly. And anyway, whatever the cause, and I suspect also international factors played a role, I think that the Russian authorities, as I've said previously, would have wanted, before they carried out a major escalation in Ukraine, deployed more troops to Ukraine, they'd have wanted to discuss these matters with their allies as well, and that might have meant that critical decisions were postponed until the Samarkand summit was out of the way. But regardless of that, I think one can see why Ukraine, which is well informed through its Western allies about the state of Russian troop numbers, might have seen in September an opportunity to carry out a major attack on Russian positions. What I would also say, though, is that if all this is correct, then one could perhaps understand Zelensky's frustration, if he really is frustrated, that this Ukrainian army of 400,000 men has not managed to achieve anything of greater significance, despite finding itself briefly in a position where it heavily outnumbered its opponents. The Kherson offensive has been a disaster. Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, is now saying that in some places the Russians are going on the attack. I'm not able to confirm that. There's been no advances in Ugledar region. In central Donetsk, Bakhmut city, as we've discussed, is now rapidly weakening. The Ukrainian positions there are rapidly weakening. And Ukraine has seen its defenses around Donetsk start to crack. There's been that successful advance in Kharkiv region, but so far, up to this point, the Ukrainians have not been able to convert that advance into a decisive strategic victory. And one thing which I am sure must have caused Zelensky and the political leaders in Kiev a great deal of frustration is the failure of Ukraine to disrupt successfully the conduct of the referendums in the four regions. I was fully expecting that when the referendums were announced, intense shelling of Donetsk city, where, to be very clear, a very large proportion of the population of Donetsk region live. I was expecting intense shelling to begin in order to disrupt the holding of that referendum. Well, I'm going to say this. There was some shelling, but it was not as intense as I, for one, had expected. And overall, it's been striking that the referendums across all of the 4 regions appear to have been conducted quite efficiently and in a fairly orderly way. Now, in saying that, I want to make clear that I'm not departing from my cynical views about these referendums, cynical views which in no way deny, by the way, that at least in Donbass, they almost certainly reflect the actual feelings of the people who live there. But the point is not whether or not these are perfect instruments of democratic expression. It is whether or not the process was conducted in an orderly way so as to make it appear convincing. And the answer is that it was. And Ukraine failed to prevent that happening. And that, to my mind, begs some very interesting questions. And I'm going to make a suggestion here, and I've seen it floating around some of the commentaries, but I'm starting to wonder whether the decision back in August to focus the few remaining forces that were left on pushing Ukrainian forces away from Donetsk city might have been connected with the need to hold referendums, the intention to hold referendums in Donetsk in September, and the need to get Donetsk city out of the range of much of the artillery that Ukraine had positioned in Donetsk region and which has been shelling Donetsk city. Now, I have to say, up to this point, I've assumed that the focus on clearing the forces in Donetsk city, which seemed to me a strange one, given that the military priority, or so it seemed to me, was to capture Bakhmut city. I suspected that the reason that happened was because of the need to satisfy or appease, if you prefer, the feelings of the Donetsk militia and its commanders, who, under the terms of the special military operation, play a leading role in this war. And that, of course, may still be true. But I wonder whether an even greater factor was, as I said, to try to get as much of that artillery as possible, as far away from Donetsk city as possible, in order to make it easier to conduct the referendum in Donetsk in September. In that case, there is a clear military political reasoning for this offensive west of Donetsk city that I had not previously anticipated. And in that case also, one has to say that the offensive has achieved that strategic political objective. It has been possible to conduct the referendum in Donetsk and to do it in a smooth and orderly way with a minimal amount of interference from the Ukrainian forces. Anyway, this is a little speculative. I'm not certain about all of this, but well, you can judge the results and reach your own conclusions. And anyway, you have my own rather tentative opinions on this question. Now, one point I would say is, and I'm going to now return to the other point that I made, that bringing these regions into the Russian Federation is quite possibly was quite possibly important, not just for all the many other reasons that we've discussed, to make it easier to move beyond the special military operation, to justify this partial mobilization, all of these things. But it may also have been something that the military, the Russian military themselves wanted. Because, of course, incorporating these regions into Russia now resolves whatever doctrinal issues about fighting in Ukraine some Russian officers might genuinely have had, in the sense that they're no longer engaged in a special military operation in the territory of another country, something which some of them might have found conceptually difficult to do. They're now, of course, straightforwardly fulfilling their prime mission, which is to defend Russia itself. Now, this is not speculation. I'm going to say this. I've been reading very carefully the Russian media, and I've noticed that, especially, in the summaries of Russian articles which have been appearing in the TASS news agency, this very particular specific point has actually been made. It's put in this way, that the Russian military will be much more motivated to defend Russian territory and Russian citizens than it would be to conduct military operations on the territory of another country. This may seem a little strange and a little surprising, but in my experience, it's very consistent with Russian practice. The Russians often find it difficult to break through the legal and theoretical constraints they impose on themselves. They create these doctrines about what the Russian armed forces are supposed to do. Officers are trained to observe these doctrines. They become hardwired in the thinking of the officer corps. And the result is that when you have to deviate, as you sometimes have to do, from these doctrines, that leads to some resistance. So it could very well be that this is what has changed, that this is one reason why that decision was made to press forward with the incorporation of these regions into Russia. I suspect the catalyst was the Kharkiv offensive, but I also think that the discussions at Samarkand, the decision to wait until the discussions at Samarkand also played a role in influencing the timing. Anyway, so all I'm going to say about those topics, as I said, this isn't pure speculation. It's based upon factual readings of information in the Russian media. It's always difficult to get a complete sense of what's going on behind the scenes in any war. One day, we will probably find out the full truth, and when we do, I think what we will discover is that Russian decision making has been far from smooth or straightforward. It has probably, almost certainly, in fact, followed a twisted road. Anyway, putting all that aside, since we've been discussing issues of Russian military doctrine, I now want to return to a particular topic, which is this subject of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, because this is becoming extremely concerning. And just as a few days ago, there was a sustained and systematic attempt to twist certain words that Putin had made at the end of his address to the nation last week, when he announced the partial mobilization. So there's been an equal attempt to misunderstand or misrepresent certain, I have to say, less carefully chosen words that the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, said in a note that he posted on Russian social media. Now I'm going to just first of all read what those words of Medvedev were. And by the way, I've noticed with some interest that you can no longer find them on his Telegram channel. But anyway, this is what Medvedev says, and I'm taking it from a summary from RT, the Russian channel. It puts it like this: NATO would not intervene if Moscow used nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Dmitry Medvedev has said, claiming that Kiev's Western backers would be unwilling to die in a nuclear apocalypse for the country. However, the former Russian president said it was highly unlikely that the conditions for warranting a nuclear response by Moscow would arise in Ukraine. Medvedev made the comments as he discussed the hypothetical use of nuclear weapons by Russia on social media on Tuesday. He dismissed remarks by Western politicians who have been warning Moscow against using nukes as direct demagoguery. The conditions permitting the use of Russia's nuclear arsenal are stated plainly and publicly in the country's nuclear doctrine. Now, this is the key phrase. Medvedev said, Moscow says it will only use its most deadly weapons if it or one of its allies is attacked with weapons of mass destruction, or if its existence is at stake in a conventional conflict. Hypothetically, if Ukraine were to pose a threat to Russia's existence, Moscow could use nuclear weapons, but the stakes would be too high for other parties to get involved. Now, this is not a threat to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It is, on the contrary, a statement that it is all but inconceivable that Russia would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The only circumstance where that might happen, realistically, judging from what Medvedev is saying, would be if Ukraine were to acquire nuclear weapons itself and were to threaten Russia with use of them. And of course, Medvedev made the point, he actually said that the Western powers sending modern arms to Ukraine is just an extra seasoning of hatred towards us, nothing more. American and European demagogues would not die in a nuclear apocalypse. This is why they will swallow the use of weapons in the ongoing conflict. So what he's saying is they don't actually have any beef. The Western powers have no beef in this. They have no real reason to respond in a nuclear conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because ultimately they're just bystanders, even though they're egging on Ukraine all the time. But ultimately, it's only if Ukraine becomes an existential threat to Russia, and that can only happen realistically if Ukraine acquires nuclear weapons, that would provoke Russia into using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And that, as Medvedev says, is simply a restatement of Russia's publicly declared doctrine. So Medvedev was not threatening Ukraine with nuclear weapons, he was in effect, though in a rather clumsy way, essentially ruling the option out. Now, people who've been talking about this, talking about Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, have not paid much attention to a very powerful article written by the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov. And it appeared in National Interest on the 28th of September, and it has clearly been written following detailed consultations with the Russian government. This is not the extemporaneous opinions of the Russian ambassador. And I'm not going to read the entire article, but I would say that first of all he begins by referencing back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place 60 years ago. And then he talks about the current situation, and this is the part of his article that I intend to read. The statements by certain politicians and the media that US-Russian relations are living through an unprecedented crisis may well be accepted. Let me remind you that just a couple of years ago, we talked about a difficult stage in the bilateral dialogue. However, no one could have even imagined that it would come to such a perilous point. Everything created over many years of hard work, including political, economic, cultural, scientific, and educational ties, has been written off to the dustbin of history. We see a deplorable, deserted picture in arms control. The anti-ballistic missile and intermediate nuclear forces treaties have sunk into oblivion. The Open Skies Treaty has virtually ceased to exist. The New START Treaty is approaching the end of its duration and, as we have repeatedly said, is not fully implemented by the American side. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is experiencing serious shocks. No one can foretell what will happen next. I have to remind readers that all of this is a result of US policy. Let me really elaborate on my point. Washington withdrew from the treaties in order to gain security advantages, especially in confronting Russia. It is in a constant search for opportunities to achieve global military dominance. Over previous decades, the NATO military machine has approached Russia's borders in several waves, where a powerful striking fist was raised over my motherland. How should we have reacted? We warned our colleagues that such steps were counterproductive, increased the risk of an arms race, and that we would not be able to ignore the aggravating threats along the perimeter of our boundaries. The last straw that broke the camel's back was NATO's attempt to launch the military technical exploitation of Ukraine and cultivate in Kiev a regime desiring to wage a bloody war against Russia. Today, our country is accused of all sins. They claim that we have unleashed an armed conflict in Europe. I have to wonder, what did the United States do to ensure the implementation of the Minsk agreements? Why did Washington keep silent for 8 years and not pull Kiev up when Ukrainians and Russians were killed in Donbass? Today, it is obvious that the United States is directly involved in the military actions of the Kiev regime. Washington is openly building up the supply of lethal weapons to Ukraine and provides it with intelligence. They jointly plan military operations against the Russian armed forces. Ukrainians have been trained to use NATO military hardware in a fight It feels like Russia is being tested to see how long it will remain patient and refrain from responding to blatantly adversarial actions and attacks. In fact, Washington is pushing the situation towards a direct confrontation of the major nuclear powers, fraught with unpredictable consequences. US officials continue to escalate the situation, intimidating the American and international public with sham Russian nuclear threats, and he puts the words nuclear threats in quotation marks. Such rhetoric twists the statement of the Russian leadership, which is what we've seen done with Putin's comments and now with Medvedev's. I would like to stress that there has been no change in the conditions when our country would use nuclear weapons. In this regard, we continue to strictly adhere to the 2014 military doctrine and 2020 basic principles of state policy on nuclear deterrence. Moscow has never mentioned an expansive interpretation of these documents, which can be found in the public domain. We are not threatening anyone, but we confirm that, as President Putin said on September 21st, Russia is ready to defend its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and our people with all weapon systems we have. What is so aggressive about this statement? What is unacceptable? Would the United States not do the same if faced with an existential threat? And then he goes on to say that he still believes that the US has not yet approached the dangerous threshold of falling into the abyss of a nuclear conflict. He also says that the United States has been threatening Russia and that it is important to stop threatening us. And he also reiterates that it would be impossible to limit or contain a nuclear war. I would like to warn American military planners about the fallacy of their assumptions that a limited nuclear conflict is possible. They apparently hope that the United States would be able to take cover behind the ocean if such a conflict happens in Europe with British and French nuclear weapons. I would stress that this is an extremely dangerous experiment. It is safe to assume that any use of nuclear weapons could quickly lead to an escalation of a local or regional conflict into a global one. So what Antonov, and as I stress again, he's talking as Russia's ambassador to the United States, and he's doing so clearly with the authority of the Russian leadership. What he is saying is that the United States is at one and the same time provoking Russia, threatening Russia, and trying to goad Russia into some kind of a military and potentially nuclear confrontation. That this is incredibly dangerous, it is extraordinarily reckless, and that the consequences of persisting in that, if taken to their ultimate conclusion, would be a nuclear confrontation, which would inevitably involve the United States itself. And he's basically saying to the Americans that this practice of provocation, threat, and goading needs to stop. Well, I doubt that anybody in Washington is listening. I suspect, on the contrary, some of the people in Washington, the decision makers there, will interpret these words of Ambassador Antonov as proof that the strategy is actually working, that the Russians are being provoked, threatened, and goaded in exactly the way that the people in Washington want it to be. I've made it very clear that I consider this to be an utterly reckless, in fact disastrously dangerous strategy. of a kind I've never seen practiced before, but there we are. Anyway, I hope I've clarified this issue. Now, the other incredibly dangerous event which has just taken place was the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, I'm not going to add anything substantive to what I said on this issue in my video yesterday. The United States, or rather the State Department, has now published a statement saying that any allegation that the United States was involved in the attacks on this pipeline is preposterous. I note that. I'm not going to comment on it. I just note that that is what the State Department has said. But there's been a very interesting article on this very topic, or rather I should say not an article, an editorial in Global Times, which is, as we know, often the mouthpiece of the Chinese government. In fact, it is regularly used by the Chinese government as its English language mouthpiece. And this editorial is incredibly carefully written, but it's not difficult when reading it through to work out who China thinks is responsible for these attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, I'm going to read extracts from this editorial, and this is the point where I'm going to start. Analysts generally believe that this attack is a special manifestation of the destructive spillover of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. Who did it? No one claimed responsibility. There have been various speculations on international social media, but all have no credible evidence, which, however, has further escalated tensions among all parties concerned and increased mutual strategic suspicion among major powers, causing more problems under the secondary disaster. In any case, the attack on major transnational infrastructure for civilian use is very odious in nature. It has already created a dangerous precedent since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Such a trend cannot be indulged. Both the European Union and Russia have demanded that relevant agencies conduct a comprehensive investigation and publicize the findings. Since the incident occurred within the exclusive economic zones of Denmark and Sweden, at the moment Germany, Denmark and Sweden are investigating on the cause of the accident. However, as this incident involves many countries, it is necessary to ask relevant international bodies to set up a joint investigation team so as to restore the truth, find out the perpetrators and make them punished accordingly as soon as possible. This incident should be prevented from becoming a Rashomon-style one. Now, if people don't know what the reference to Rashomon is, it is a reference to a story and a film by the famous Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, in which various witnesses to a murder give their accounts of the murder, which on the surface seem to contradict each other. What Global Times says is, at this point, is that just leaving it for the Western powers, Germany, Sweden and Denmark, to conduct this investigation by themselves is not good enough. What's needed is a full, independent investigation, because otherwise what we will get is a biased outcome to any investigation, and that is going to create more problems than it solves. And then the editorial becomes even more interesting. Although the truth is unknown for now, one thing is certain. No matter which side pressed the button to damage Nord Stream pipelines, it has dealt a heavy blow to Russia-Europe energy cooperation. The EU made great efforts to stabilise energy prices previously, but the Nord Stream leaks are likely to offset these all. High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, issued a statement on Wednesday stating that any deliberate disruption of European energy infrastructure is utterly unacceptable. As the coldest winter has followed the summer of discontent, a larger wave of corporate bankruptcies and economic recession have come to the door of Europe. And then it gets more interesting still. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines would be in no one's interests. But why have incidents that are in no one's interests happened again and again? Notice, happened again and again. This deserves serious consideration by the international community. The ill-fated destiny of Nord Stream 2 pipeline itself explains quite a few issues. The major mutually beneficial and win-win cooperation program between Russia and the EU has met firm opposition from the United States since day one. From repeated verbal threats to many rounds of sanctions, the United States has shown its firm stance. It won't stop until it messes up Nord Stream 2. After the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Nord Stream 2, a cooperation project that is actually beneficial to European people's livelihood, was on the verge of bankruptcy under the multiple pressure of hegemonism, geopolitical calculation, and security dilemmas, i.e. under US pressure. This deliberate sabotage has snuffed out the possibility of its revival. It is not difficult to feel that there is an invisible scissors cutting the ties of interests between Russia and Europe. Those who control the scissors are playing politics. When the ties of interests are cut off, Russia and Europe will be left with a tragic confrontation, and the lives of a large number of ordinary people will turn out to be the biggest victim. The Nord Stream, just continue a little, one more rather interesting paragraph. The Nord Stream incident again shows that the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not limited to the military battlefield, but has spilt over to energy, economy, food, and even public opinion warfare. The incident in the town in northern Kiev, the editorial names the town, but I'm not going to, in April this year cast a heavy shadow on the truce negotiations, which were at a critical moment. Now the pipeline accident has it once again compressed the room for parties involved in the conflict to reach a political settlement. More worryingly, no one knows whether the planning of the next incident, like the one that took place in that town north of Kiev, or Nord Stream incident, is already underway. This uncertainty will be the sword of Damocles hanging over Europe and even the entire world. Now, the Chinese are not saying here it was the United States, but if you pass this editorial carefully, everything they say leads you to that conclusion. It was the United States which objected to energy cooperation between Europe and Russia. It was the United States that did everything in its power to prevent Nord Stream 2 coming into effect. It is the United States that wants to reduce as far as possible opportunities for peace between Russia and Europe and between Russia and Ukraine. It is the Nord Stream incident reduces those possibilities, and the people who are wielding the invisible scissors that are slicing off, cutting the ties of interests between Russia and Europe, well, it's not difficult to guess who the Chinese think those people who are wielding those invisible scissors are. Now, there's been much discussion, speculation, controversy, rumour about what Chinese policy with respect to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and between Russia and the West is. Well, I think this article, this editorial in Global Times, they're written in the most, as I said, careful way. Doesn't want to come out straightforwardly and says it was the United States, and quite rightly so, because as the editorial correctly says, clear evidence of that does not exist and perhaps never will. But anyway, the Chinese are absolutely clear in their own minds that this entire crisis has been created by the United States as part of its geopolitical quest to maintain its position as the dominant power in the world. And if you think back to that article in National Interest that the Russian ambassador Anatoly Antonov wrote, you can see that Antonov was essentially saying the same thing as the Chinese. In other words, there is a community of thinking in Moscow and Beijing about this crisis. Now, we will see where we go. I repeat again, this is the quiet before the storm. Over the next few days, perhaps hours, these 4 regions will become formally incorporated into Russia. The West will impose further sanctions, that's a given, though it's difficult to see what these sanctions can do, which the existing sanctions have not done already, except perhaps make the global economic situation even worse. But anyway, put all that aside, we are in the quiet before the storm. But if you're to change the metaphor, the game which is being played is afoot. The pieces have been moving. Some very, very reckless and dangerous decisions have been made. And the next few months, globally, are going to be extremely turbulent. There it is. At this point, I'm going to stop this video. I've been speaking for over 50 minutes. I think that's long enough. Thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforu, and where, by the way, we regularly invite various guests to join us. Remember, you can join us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Telegram. And of course, on Locals, I do a live stream which is exclusive to Locals every Wednesday. I did a humongous and brilliant live stream, in my opinion. Brilliant. What made it brilliant was the quality of the questions on Locals yesterday. So I am going to say that if you want to put questions to me directly, well, join us on Locals, and you can do so through the medium of that live stream. And I should add, I conduct it every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. You can also remember you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to check your subscription to this channel and to press the like button. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day until we speak again.